The content you're about to enjoy comes from the archives of The Best You. We're devoted to the very best in personal development. With a magazine and resources dedicated to inspiring and changing people's lives, at The Best You, we work with the world's leading writers and trainers on the evolution of the self, and people whose journeys have been affected by their work and words. For more information, go to www.thebestyou.co.
So, good morning. Great to see you here. My name's Steve Davies, and welcome. So, I'm the founder, CFO. I do a lot of stuff, but latterly, when we did a rebrand, I got called the Chief Colour Linguist of Clarity 4D. And the reason for that is because I'm meant to know a little bit about psychology as a backdrop to what we now use it for heavily in organisations and for individuals, about diversity and inclusion. But I like to say about inclusion and diversity, because what's the end you want to get to? You want to be thinking about how to include people. And the purpose of me talking today is to give you a sense of how in business, by including people, it leads to better productivity. And I think most corporates, and actually most individuals, are looking at how do they become a little bit more productive and effective, both in work and indeed outside. So I'm going to take you through a bit of a journey for the next 35 minutes, which will give you a sense of what we're about and what some of my beliefs are. And please chirp up if you want to ask any questions. So this is really just saying that when we talk about learning, it's something that doesn't stop. And a lot of people even think that learning is something to do with education when you go through the formal bit. But I think what we're looking at now is a real transgression. A lot of people thinking about, well, why does learning stop? It actually ought to keep going right to the very end of our days. So whether you start at here, and some of you may have children, and if you haven't got children, you've certainly been a child. Think back to when learning was at its greatest. And I would argue that learning is at its greatest when children are around and that you are there as a child, because there are no barriers. There are no barriers. And if we link it to what we're talking about, actually, there's not very much lack of inclusion. Children just have a way of playing, and generally, unless barriers are put up there, they just keep playing with whoever is in front of them. That includes adults and people of the same ilk. But equally, at the other end of the scale, we're in the university of the third age. A lot of people are really looking at why do they continue to learn, whether they're in work or out of work, and how do they do it to maximum effect. And there's lots of technology that can help do that. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how we're using technology to hopefully be leading edge in these lines. So when I started looking at learning, and Clarity 4D is actually a psychometric, a behavioural model, which gives a language of learning. One of the things that seemed to be missing for me when we designed it was to have it implicit that it led to action. So this is just sort of saying, well, 1D, Clarity 4D, what's the 1D about? Well, the 1D is find out who you are. Find out your base camp. If you're climbing a mountain, you need to find the base camp because that's the beginning of the exercise. And the second thing you got to do, unless you work in isolation, is you need to share it with people. So 2D is getting a sense of how they see you. 1D is how I see me. But 2D is how do they see me? And because they're different, or your behaviour to them could be different, you may find that different people see your qualities in a slightly different way. Which leads to 3D. And 3D is about receiving that feedback, getting some awareness of how people see you and why your behaviours are maybe seen not so well by certain people, and making a decision, well, what am I going to do about that? It may be in service of your work. It may be about choosing partners in life. It may be getting on better with your family. But just in the workplace, it's really important that you think about how agile am I about adapting and connecting with different people to meet the needs of the business and your own needs, to have a happy work life. So that's 3D, your personal diversification to adapt. And 4D excuse me, is just making decisions about what you want to achieve and how quickly you want to achieve it. So it's actually putting an action, a decision about your development at the heart of what we're about. And I love this phrase, in search of higher ground. There's clearly a link to scaling a mountain. In search of higher ground is a mental intention, a need to get to a place where you feel more capable and more robust in your development, so that you can deal with the challenges of business and non-business life more effectively. And we use that, as this says, this is, I'm not quite sure whether this is a bit of pure chance, whether it's Elon Musk and his recent takeoff and landing back on planet Earth. But we use the language of colour. And the language of colour helps to make behaviours simple. It helps people to understand why people are different. And it gives a language of diversity which is cross-cultural. And if you don't hear anything else from me in the next 28 minutes, I just encourage you to think about, well, what is it that we have right now on planet Earth that helps us to understand diversity? We get confused by gender. We get confused by age. We get confused by ethnicity, where people come from, what their education is, what religion they are. It's very confusing to try and work out who people are. So actually, having 4 simple colours is a language that links to the elements, earth, air, fire and water, which is right at the heart of humanity. You can go anywhere on the planet and people basically understand, what do you mean by earth, air, fire and water? And all we're really doing is saying, here's a language to help people understand that in a workplace. Nice and simple. And helping them to think about what might they want to work on to get a little bit better to meet the needs of other people, the business, but perhaps most importantly, themselves.
For complimentary resources from my book, my complimentary e-course, The Power of the Question, or recommended reads, go to www.thequestion/resources. For more information on my coaching or mentoring, go to www.bernardo-moya.com. So I've got to a certain age where I was born in the 50s. And I was watching, sometimes when you're doing a little presentation, just occasionally things come to you at the right time. And 3 nights ago, I was just thinking, well, I got most of what I wanted to talk about right, but there was something missing. There was a little bit of a theme. And I found myself watching something, which will become clear in a minute, Desert Island Discs. And in the middle of Desert Island Discs, this phrase was used. And apparently this was, when I was born in 1950-something, this was common in London and there's a couple of people nodding affirmatively. In London, in the 50s, it was not uncommon to see on a bed and breakfast window this. Now, I find this difficult to accept, but apparently no blacks, no Irish, and no dogs on the same placard. Now, I'm going to come back to that in a minute because it hit me and I thought, we've progressed, but how far have we really progressed? And thinking about this within the corporate world as well as, bed and breakfast in London. Marco Bizzarri is the CEO of Gucci. So he's linking this to productivity and effectiveness. Diversity and inclusion, which are the real grounds for creativity, diversity of thought, diversity of behaviour, understanding of the extremes, must be kept at the centre of what we do. Because if you do that, you create a culture of acceptance that you will have diverse thought. You will have people explaining things in a different way. And that can only be good so long as you have understanding. It helps you go from frustration about difference
to fascination about why somebody is different. So what was the phrase? No blacks, no dogs, and no Irish. And if you're not familiar with Desert Island Discs, this lady was on just a few weeks ago, and I found myself just listening to this by accident. I don't even know why it came up on my laptop. I was staying in a little B&B nearby to here in London. And she is the one of the most well-known double bassists, not just in the UK, but in the world now. So a double bass, for those who aren't aware, is about me plus about a foot. She's 5 foot tall. And she was an Olympic runner in UK, in Kent, about to go to the Olympics in Montreal, I think it was, about 30 years ago. And she, for a little bit of a joke, she played in a football match and she did her knee rather badly, so she never got to go to the Olympics. Her times were good enough to go. She was definitely in the team. She didn't get to go, and it ended her career. She went back to school in Kent, and the story goes that the head teacher said, "You're so good at so many things. We think if you choose an instrument which is not necessarily the best well-known, then you might be successful, have a career in music." And he then took her to the room in which the double bass was. So at one level, that's kind of like a little story. But what she's now done, and I was fascinated by this because she's mixed race, and I'd really encourage you to listen to this Desert Island disc because it really got me thinking. But her mother is Irish and her father is an Igbo from Nigeria. Sadly, I think they're both passed now. But she tells the story that just a couple of miles from here in London in the 50s, they met. Her mother had been there dancing at Hammersmith Palais, for those who know it, or not dancing is the point of the story. They were there for a couple of hours, then nobody wanted to dance with them. She was leaving, and this tall, good-looking black guy said, "Where are you going?" And she said, "Well, we're leaving. Nobody wants to dance. It's the days when you had to be asked to dance." And he said, "Well, I'm staying, and I'd love to dance with you." And the rest is history. But the point is that they then set up in London an Irish Catholic mother with a Nigerian father, and they tried to get accommodation, and they were confronted by no blacks, no Irish, and no dogs. And with this spirit, they eventually got it, but they did go to, I think she talks about they went to sort of 20 to 30 places, and they said, "Well, 2 out of 3, we've got no dog. Any chance of staying?" And eventually they settled down and they created a family, and Chichi and Wanaku is their offspring. And what I loved about listening to what she talked about, she has just set up, because my question would be to you, how many black or ethnic minority people do you know in orchestras in the United Kingdom, or indeed anywhere around the world? The answer is extraordinarily low. She's just set up a orchestra which is only for that minority, to prove the point, if you like, to show that it can be done, that there is the quality. And she talks about how people have blind auditions. So they do it behind a screen to play. And I think even in corporates, we're sort of looking at questions about, do we start making judgments through unconscious bias upon how people look, their age, and all the other things that confuse us, going back to my point a little while ago. So I'd encourage you to listen to that, because I found it very thought-provoking about what she's about and why she's trying to do it. And she talks about the corporate world as well. And I think it's really, really important that some of the messages that we see through... corporates are actually about a bit like an orchestra. If you think about your business as an orchestra, what you're trying to do is get individuals to aspire to play their very best, but to do it collectively. And that's why I love the term about in search of higher ground, because if you can get people to do that and be a communion together, it leads to an outstanding sound. And in business, we're looking for that in terms of productivity and performance and retention. So why should you care? Why should you care about the benefits of having a diverse perspectives? And you can probably look at that and see instantly what it is. And if you can't, that's okay. But why not? Because it's the same as that. But we're conditioned. We see the world literally one way for those of us who are lucky enough to live in this part of the world in the West. You don't see it that way very often, but it's the same. And right in the middle of that is a place called 56 countries in Africa. And we've done an awful lot in Africa with Clarity 4D because it's a fantastic testing ground. We talk about diversity and inclusion and some of the challenges in the United Kingdom and in the West, but we know nothing. Because if you haven't been to Africa, then you'll really get to understand what diversity and inclusion means. Because in the previous mix, I didn't talk about tribalism. That exists there too. And one of the great things, we've done a lot in South Africa, the Rainbow Nation, we found that we had huge success because the language of 4 colours cuts through all of the stuff that confuses people. It gives people a way to understand diversity through psychological and behavioural preference and learn how to be inclusive. For business reasons, for better relationships, not just in the business but outside it. So by truly understanding diversity, what does it do? Well, it promotes humanistic values. It improves productivity and profitability. And some people question that, but it does. It allows for the exchange of innovative ideas and to get that sort of change of thought that we talked about earlier and increase creativity and problem solving. Most businesses are going through change. That brings problems. This sort of model helps people to find out why they go through change at different speeds. Some people see the vision and jump to it. Other people wonder why and step reluctantly towards it. So here's a fact. Racially diverse teams outperform non-diverse ones by 35%. I'd encourage you to do your own research. That's something that struck me that was important in terms of this whole question. Fewer CEOs are women than are named David. And it's got worse. This is only one metric, but it's actually got worse. And you might say, well, CEOs, that's one thing. But unfortunately, the data set seems to point to if you don't have diversity at the top, it doesn't work much better as you go further down. And some of you may be aware of that and happy to carry on that conversation if it's relevant. So what about the power of inclusion? The power of inclusion. And I'd love to spend a lot of time going through this, but for this purposes, I haven't got a lot of time now. But begin with the end in mind is something that some of you may know, linked to Stephen Covey. This formula is relevant to any business. Every business on the left-hand side of the formula is trying to create value. To create value on the right-hand side of the formula, you've got to drive down risk by processes and structures. You also have to have opportunity to have better ways to do things, creativity, opportunity, new ways, and there's a tension between the two. That's called change.
For more information on collaborating, partnering, sponsoring, supporting, or speaking at any of our events or finding out more about our legacy clubs, go to www.thebestyou.co. If you're interested in finding out more about the amazing content we have, please go to www.thebestyou.online and get your 14-day free trial now.
Every business has to look at operational cash. I like to make this really simple. That's how effective are the meetings in a business. Because if you don't have inclusion and effectiveness in meetings, people enrolled with the decisions of a meeting, you lead to less than optimal productivity. So this is about teams, higher performing teams in an organisation, just being more joined up in how they work together. And last but not least, ironically, investing for the future, most businesses don't have a lot of capital, they have a lot of people, and it's the people that are not always thought of as an asset. They're actually a cost on a balance sheet. So that sort of explains sometimes why training, learning and development is the first thing to go. Well, as soon as you do that, as soon as you have that mindset, you are ironically creating greater risk in your business. You're not future-proofing it by having great quality people enrolled, onboarded and effective in teams. So I'd ask you to just think about that. If you're in an organisation, how well does this get dealt with in your business? Because if not, it is a risk in itself, and it's a threat to creating greater value as you go forwards into the next financial year. Everything we do is based upon Jungian psychology, and I just wanted. This is historic and is embedded in stuff which is very human, and most psychometrics used in the West are based upon Carl Jung's thoughts and theories. We've talked about the 1 to 4D. That's a process for making sure that whatever you establish through individuals, it takes them to action, both as individuals, teams, and indeed for corporates. We use a colour language of cards to help make it simple, because if it's not simple, it's too confusing. If you're at the top of the house, you haven't got a lot of time. And in some businesses, people don't have a lot of time for training either, or they're not invested in, which is even worse. So it has to be simple and palatable and easy to understand. This is our way, imagine this on a number of levels, of looking at a whole organisation. This is just a simple team map, but it's a way of looking at the mapping, literally the mapping of how teams are formed and how they perform. And we're doing an awful lot with the police in the UK, right now with the London Metropolitan Police. So we've got a lot of data sets which are proving to be very interesting. But just taking it out of the corporate world just for a bit, we like to work with youth. We like to invest in youth. We're doing a lot of that in Africa, where innovation is taking place, and there's real opportunities to improve performance of the youth, basically. So we're doing a lot in that. And we are working with families as well. So we do a lot with carers organisations, the NHS, and public organisations, police, fire and ambulance. And outside of the corporate, we like to ask people to think about this from learning about colour and diversity through their own families. So if you ever want to know a little bit about that, then by all means come and see us today at G13. But ongoing, the family map is, we found the best way for people to learn about colour and diversity, which they then take to work, because they understand the people in their family. And this, for me, was quite enlightening 20 years ago. I really didn't understand why my brother saw decisions that we made about mum and dad completely differently to me. I now do. Building your own relationship map in an organisation is really key, because doing that, you actually start to understand risk of poor relationships in business. If you don't, we all know there are people in organisations that you don't particularly get enthusiastic about going to yet another meeting with. Well, we kind of measure that, and we get people to think about it, take it to their conscious mind and measure it and say, well, what are you going to do about it then to reduce the risk, not just for yourself, but also for the business? That leads to the business being in more flow, better meetings, greater productivity. So high-performing teams, my last few thoughts, are key. Knowing, is there a mixture in your organisation to what does that mean, is fundamental. And we can help to establish that. But all of this has been around for about 20, 30 years in the UK. We've been doing some of this stuff for a long time now. But there was one thing missing, and which the current marketplace needs. Nobody's really built behavioural models into software. Nobody's put people at the centre of software. And now we have. We've started, and it's actually working now, we've built our colours into software, and we've done just one at the moment with an Atlassian product, which is one of the fastest growing software companies in the world, used in a lot of public services. And we are creating the concept of to teamify. Is it an adjective or is it a verb? And I would suggest to you that the key thing here is that you use software to use colour as a language on a daily basis. How do teams work together? What should I do for that meeting next week? Am I preparing for it, mindful of the inclusion of everybody that's coming to that meeting? And the colour language supports that. And software helps us to do it in a readily accessible way. That leads to greater performance. And we're seeing some quite striking improvements because it's being done on a daily basis. People aren't taking a behavioural model, a psychometric, a book, and putting it into a drawer. They're using it daily. So to teamify is something that I think you will start to hear more of. And the more organisations really get that into their DNA will lead to better and higher performance. We do a range of profiles, which you're welcome to come and talk to us about. Love to find out more. And if you want to sign up for receiving stuff, there's accreditations at clarity4d.com, or just come and see us on G13, or drop us an email to the website. And finally, I'm not sure whether Aristotle said this, but I've heard it a lot in Africa when I've been working there. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I'd encourage you to think about that in this world of collaboration, diverse working, and how do you make sure that you still remain inclusive? It leads to better performance. Been a lot of fun. Thanks for listening. See you again.
For more information, go to www.thebestyou.co.